really discuss is considerations for employers when it comes to what everybody's referring to as the new norm. I know we had somebody referring to the new norm while we were all in the waiting room as well. But yes, I just want to make certain, Tove, you can see my screen. I'm busy sharing it. You can see basically what offices should be looking like at the moment. Am I correct?
Yes, I can see it, Barry.
Okay, 100%. Yes. And yeah, I'm going to be talking a lot of considerations when it comes to labor relations and employment relations. And one thing I always like to do with employment relations is really start from the beginning and give everybody a bit of a background as to the nature of the employment relationship. And that's what really gives us an understanding of how we're going to work going forward. It's a very interesting scenario that we're living in. And I mean, as a labor lawyer, I deal with labor laws that for the larger extent remain unchanged. So when we went into the scenario of a new COVID world and the directives in terms of the Disaster Management Act, it created quite a lot of challenges for us and in advising clients as to what they can and cannot do when it comes to the employment relationship and what was expected on everybody. And what's been even greater is that because of the levels that we're now sitting in, the advice that I would be giving, say, 2 months ago is vastly different from what we're considering today. But I think one thing that we have taken away from the hard lockdown going into a phased-in approach, and as well now sitting with these directives where we're all advised to be working from home, is that a lot of employers are going to be looking at this and looking at the positives of a workforce that is decentralized from an office space. And we just need to then take into account the considerations. And like with everything, employers and employees don't necessarily know the answers where they might even be straightforward. So let me start off by doing what I refer to as balancing of the rights. Now, I've created an equation to assist us in understanding the nature of an employment relationship. Now, when it comes to employment, and I'm using that phrase employment rather than a contract of employment, and I'll explain why. The reason why there is such an occurrence is a reciprocal one. Employers enter into a employment relationship with employees to provide a specific standard of work in order to receive a specific amount of remuneration for that work. Unless obviously you sitting in home affairs, then I don't know, you'll probably be getting paid. I don't know if there's a standard of work required of you. But anyway, so for the greater and larger extent, we enter into employment relationships to receive remuneration and to provide a working relationship. So let's say, for example, there is no contract of employment. Does that mean that there is no employment relationship in place? And that's where I was saying that the Labour Relations Act has actually changed and been amended in 2015 to dispel this myth. And despite the fact that we are sitting in 2020, I still get calls from employers that will say to me that they've got an employee that's been working with them, and they refer to them as an employee, and they say they've been working with me for the last 6 months, but they haven't yet signed a contract of employment. Does that mean that I can then just tell them to leave if things don't work out? Because there's no employment relationship or contract signed yet. And that's where they actually removed the word contract from the Labour Relations Act. So prior to 2015, the definition of a dismissal in terms of the Labour Relations Act would be when an employer terminates a contract of employment with or without notice. Now, they say when an employer terminates employment, because that employment and the protection given by the Labour Relations Act is the moment that there's that reciprocal relationship of receiving remuneration for a specific standard of work. Now, I'm simplifying that because obviously there has to be the presumption as to who is an employee in terms of Section 200A, and I know that in the viewers today, there's a lot of atypical type of relationships when it comes to brokers and so forth. So I'm referring to specifically where there's an employment relationship, where you satisfy the needs that the person is deemed to be an employee, and there's a reciprocal remuneration. That means that you are then protected by the Labour Relations Act. So if I employ somebody to provide, let's say, sell used cars in order to receive 10,000 Rand, If they sell those 10 cars, it doesn't mean that they can spend the rest of the month on the golf course. Because not only do we enter into this reciprocal relationship with regards to that bottom line that I'm referring to, but we also enter into terms and conditions of employment. Now, these terms and conditions of employment are entered into with usually a contract, a written contract, or it can even be verbal. But basically what this would entail would be, let's say, specifics of benefits, or let's say, for example, you're working from 9 to 5 and your working hours. That would be contained in your terms and conditions of employment, and that's the small bracket. In addition to that, because of the civil relationship of an employment contract or a relationship, not only do employees have to adhere to their terms and conditions of employment, but they have to adhere to the rules that an employer can create within their organization. Now, that doesn't only have to be a disciplinary code. That can also include any other procedural processes when it comes to safety, security, let's say your COVID-19 policy at this point in time. So that is really your brackets that cover that employment relationship. So now the question gets asked, what happens if we enter into an employment relationship, but there is no, and we know that I too would probably have all its employment contracts in place. You guys as maybe business owners yourselves would have all your contracts in place. But what happens if a reciprocal relationship is entered into, let's say there's a verbal agreement, but there's no terms and conditions written, and let's say the employer doesn't have a disciplinary code per se. Now, that's where we refer to what is the default settings. The moment this relationship is entered into, there are statutes that come in automatically. These would be your Basic Conditions of Employment Act, your Employment Equity Act, your Labor Relations Act, your Skills Development Act, vice versa. So that would be your larger bracket that then covers that employment relationship, your default settings. Now, to explain this a bit more, if you have a look at terms and conditions of employment, they need to conform with the larger bracket. What that means is that even if I had to enter into a written contract of employment that says, let's use an easy example, I only get 10 days per annum of annual leave. Now, we know that the bare minimum in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act is 15 working days for an employee that works 5 days, at least 5 days a week. So despite the fact I've entered into a written contract with my employer, because it contradicts the statute, which is the larger bracket would suffice. So any terms and conditions we put into our relationship with employees that contradict any of the statutes that have been provided are automatically, and I don't want to use the word, but let's say are trumped by the statute. So then when it comes to rules, quite often we have a scenario where an employee might say that there is no specifics in the disciplinary code about a particular offense, or let's say there's no specifics about a specific situation that they're now being held accountable for, or there is no disciplinary code at all. We need to understand that if there is no rules and regulations in place, that does not necessarily mean that employees can then go and run amok. Where we have to create awareness about it, that's another story. But when it comes to not having a disciplinary code in place, we then rely on what they refer to as common law. And common law is specifically that. It's created by case law, it's created by scenarios that have gone through the labor courts, and that is basically the laws that are binding on both employers and employees, whether they like it or not, the moment they enter into this remuneration for a standard of work relationship, just as much as the statutes are. So this is what creates the balance of rights when you enter into an employment relationship. So let's get into the common law principles, because they're quite pertinent, specifically where we are entering into a COVID-19 situation where there aren't necessarily write-ups in everybody's contracts, and there isn't terms and conditions and necessarily rules that are in place that would have foreseen a COVID-19. So for the better part, as employers, we're going to be relying quite heavily on statutes as well as common law. So what are those common laws? The duty of employers, for example, is to receive the employee into service, to remunerate the employee, to ensure safe working conditions. Now, that's something that I want to, obviously elaborate further on. General contractual duties, and then your statutory duties in terms of those statutes. For employees, that's where they are required to enter and remain in service, to maintain reasonable efficiency, to further the employer's business interests, to be respectful and obedient, and to refrain from misconduct generally. So an employee that has no disciplinary code can't go and rely on that fact for getting away with things such as not acting in the best interests of the employer, let's say idleness, absenteeism, or insubordination, because those are common law duties that are in place in an employment relationship, whether they like it or not. Now, how do we balance these rights and these common law duties when this is the new norm when it comes to the employment relationship? This is the new employee's office. And the answer, quite simply, is that the rights and the balancing of this right, including common law responsibilities and the statutes, remain unchanged. They remain in place. And that's where we then have to delve into workshopping the practicalities of then balancing these rights going forward, specifically when it comes to managing staff or working in a new employment environment where we haven't foreseen how these things would be applied. And let me give an example. Now, a duty of an employer is to ensure safe working conditions. Yes, there's the Occupational Health and Safety Act that comes into play. We've now got the COVID-19 aspect, that the directive in terms of the Disaster Management Act and the NICDs is coming up with different aspects. Now, what happens if that's your home office or that's your employee's home office? How on earth are we going to be able to ensure a safe working environment for them? The answer, quite simply, is from a logistical point of view, where an employer would not have access to an employee's private residence. Effectively, they would not have the reasonable control over the safe working environment. So effectively, an employee that's making their 15th trip to the fridge to go and get food while they're under lockdown, that trips down the stairs or let's say trips over a cable that they've inserted into a wall in an unsafe manner, they cannot go and sue their employer, and the employer cannot be held accountable for that, because it would be unreasonable for the employer to be able to go and access their private residence and go and stick up stickers and ensure occupational health and safety. So when an incident occurs with occupational health and safety, specifically within the workplace, there's an extra onus on that employer to adhere to the provisions of a health and safety measure, such as, let's have a look at the COVID-19 directive when it comes to screening of employees coming in onto campus. Now, when it's at home, they would never hold an employer accountable because they wouldn't have reasonably had the access to it. Therefore, what would a reasonable employer do? And that's where we're employing our employers to create awareness around it, advising and guidelines, but not necessarily control measures. Put it this way, you wouldn't necessarily be able to go, it would be a hard ask to go and discipline an employer for a workspace that looks like the picture that I've got up at the moment. It's going to be hard to go and do that because they could just say, well, I cleaned it up later on. How are you going to prove that it was unsafe? It's a very difficult situation. But for the greater part, the employer does not have to or does not have the ability to adhere to that specific aspect of the common law principles. Now, something I wanted to add as well, and that was just with lingo that everybody would have probably heard through the media during the hard lockdown phase and level 4, and before we went into advanced level 3. And that would have been where there was this scenario of a no work, no pay situation. And now you would have seen the first duty of an employer is to receive the employee into service. And the first duty of an employee was to enter themselves into service and to provide their service for their employer. Now, when the Disaster Management Act created that hard lockdown for everybody, except for essential services workers, or in levels 4 to 3, where there was a limited release of specific scenarios, that created a lawful impediment for employees to be able to honor their contracts. And because it was double-sided, which means that an employer would have been committing a contradiction to the Disaster Management Act, and an employer and an employee, both of them would have been effectively committing an offense by continuing their service. That lawful impediment created what they called a supervening impossibility of being able to work. And that's where the creation of putting an employment relationship on ice was entered into. And you would have heard through the media of employees sitting with a no work, no pay situation. And where the government has said, we are not allowing you to work, and it goes against your constitutional right to trade and to earn a living, that's where the UIF stepped in. And despite the fact that UIF is an unemployment insurance fund, despite the fact that employees were still employed, they gave them access to UIF benefits as minimal as they are. And I know that that has been a headache on its own, and I don't even want to get into a TERS situation. But that's just to explain where that came from going forward. So what is the difference then with people working from home? Now, we need to understand that the hands-on management style, to me, is the biggest new normal. The new normal for me is where managers are having to come up with creative ways of being able to measure output. And I know that it sounds, maybe for you guys as a professional body, very old school, where the performance of an individual is based on their actual being at work. Now, we all know that there are corporate cruisers out there, and those are those guys that are walking around during business hours with files under their arms, but not actually doing anything. Now, going forward, we want to actually go and measure output on these people. And that's whether you're working from home or whether from an office. What employers are doing now is looking at, rather than a hands-on being able to see you at the office determination that you are providing work, rather than an output-based working environment. I'm going to also speak about leave management, time management, performance management, and then what we are seeing as LabourNet are the new forms of misconduct to look out for out there, because it might seem like an easy excuse now, but we've seen that it's actually employees misconducting themselves. And then just really discussing the virtual disciplinary process, because that's something that gets challenged quite often when it comes to working from home or in the virtual workplace. So what is the first priority when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic? And employers and employees alike have to ensure, first of all, their own safety and the safety of the staff. And that is, and we are assisted as employers with that through the guidelines of government acts and directives. It's very interesting, and it's a challenge for employers because company policy and rules of the employer are having to change almost on a moment's notice, because of the fact that a directive doesn't necessarily get provisioned and then told that it's going to happen. We've been finding, I this morning got the directive that is for the tourism industry. Now, it landed on my desk this morning. I'm having to do consolidated versions of that to send out to clients. Now, we're having to react straight away. And when the government acts are coming in and the rules and all these are coming in through government, employers are having to react at a moment's notice and creating awareness of what's happening. But when it comes to the government acts, and we've seen the latest one when it comes to the screening process and your scenario screening, dealing with, and I'm going to deal with it on the next slide, is where how we deal with sick leave when it comes to those that have contracted COVID-19 or those that have some asymptomatic but exposure to it, and let's discuss that. So let's look at leave provisions. Now, the question that gets asked about leave is that if I'm working from home and we are finding that employees are providing themselves with leave in creative ways or giving themselves the day off, but they're not actually then going and applying for leave under the normal circumstances. It's easy to see whether somebody is not working when they're not at the office. But what about those employees that we just don't chat to on a day-to-day basis and we expect them to be doing their work, but they're basically taking the day off? Now, managers and workers alike have to adhere to the provisions of your annual leave policies. So that means that an employee that is not able to provide that standard of work due to the fact that they're going to be doing other things or rest and relaxation has to, by law, and in terms of the reciprocal relationship, put in for that annual leave. And they're still entitled to that annual leave that they would normally have during normal contractual obligations. The biggest the biggest change that we've seen is with regards to sick leave. And what I've been finding is that a lot of employers are in a COVID-19 environment forgetting about the normal aspects of leave. What I'm referring to is employees that now have a common cold or common flu are treated as if they've got COVID-19. We need to be able to assimilate between the directives in terms of COVID-19 and where somebody is normally ill. I know that under the current circumstances, employers do have the attitude of, I just don't want to take the chance. So it is a lot easier rather to rather treat everybody the same when it comes to COVID-19. But what we need to understand is that the normal sick leave provisions apply, which means that you can, whatever sickness, the moment you are unable to adhere to your specific standard of work due to illness, on whatever means, you still have to adhere to the company's sick leave policy. Which means that if I have a common cold and I am staying at work for a period of 2 or more days and I work from home, or whether I have to go into the office, but if I'm at home but I'm not able to do my duties because I'm going to be lying in bed the whole day, I have to still provide proof of my illness. And we'll talk about how that then fits in with a COVID-19 scenario. So any normal forms of illness or injury are treated in the normal manner, despite the fact that employees are working from home. When it comes to sick leave as well, what we are seeing, and the biggest aspect of dealing with COVID-19 potential cases, is the exposure. A lot of employers who have children that are sitting at school are now starting to deal with the new situations. And I can see already from myself, as a litigator, I spend my life at the CCMA. And what has happened subsequently in the last 3 weeks is that all 3 CCMAs that I go to almost on a weekly basis have been closed for 2 days or more for deep cleaning as a result of a confirmed case going through their doors. The same thing is happening at schools, where employees are now not reporting for duty, or where they're working from home, it obviously continues as normal, but where employees are not reporting for duty because they're saying that their children's school tested positive and therefore they are self-isolating. We need to understand how the self-isolation aspect works, the quarantine or special leave aspects of it. And the way that government has done it is they've split it into 4 scenarios. And I know I don't have a diagram of this, but just to run through those 4 scenarios, and basically where employees would find themselves in those 4 scenarios, is effectively one, where an employee tests positive for COVID-19. What do we do under those circumstances? And that would obviously be where the person then has to self-isolate until an extent that they are then clear. The second scenario would be where an employee shows symptoms. The employee shows the symptoms of COVID-19 as directed by the NICD, which is the dry cough and the fever and all those aspects that have been directed. So if an employee demonstrates that would be where they then need to go and get tested. Then you have 2 other scenarios, your third and your fourth scenario, which is dealing with the situation that I gave you now. The third situation, which would be where there's an asymptomatic employee, so an employee that doesn't show signs of COVID-19, but who has had a high risk exposure. Now, we all know, and I'm sure a lot of you that have maybe even gone to police stations or have gone to departments or gone to specific businesses, let's say going and frequenting a client's business, or even gone into your own business, you would see that you're keeping a register. When you entered into the business, when you left the business, and that is to do what they refer to as the tracking and tracing of potential exposure. So what that means, and where you've got a high exposure, would be where an employee or a person has been exposed to a confirmed case of COVID-19. And that doesn't mean that you frequented the same premises, but it means that you frequented the same premises for a period of time exceeding 15 minutes, where it is confirmed that a confirmed case of COVID-19, as well as yourself, were in that premises at the same time. That is what they refer to as a high-risk exposure. A low-risk exposure would be that first example I gave, where your child is sent home because the schools are closed. By law, those that have had a direct exposure in terms of the directive have to be notified. And we've had scenarios where parents of kids that have been to schools that have now been subsequently closed as a result of COVID-19 are saying that they aren't telling us who has COVID-19. If they are not telling you as a parent directly that your child has had a direct exposure to a confirmed case, we would then, and I hate the word assumption, but effectively then by law, they have not had to go and through track and trace, inform those parties that they've been potentially on a high risk exposure. So If you have just been notified that the shopping center that you were at yesterday has been closed, that doesn't mean that you're on a high risk exposure. But if that shopping center releases a statement that says that this person potentially had this person who was a frontline employee was present at the shopping center for this period of time to that period of time, and you know that you were there during that period of time, that then increases the risk. But where you've then found out that something that you frequented has closed, it doesn't create a high risk exposure until you have been informed as a result thereof. So let's run through these scenarios and how it works. So an employee that has a child at a school that has been closed, low risk exposure because they haven't been informed directly that their child was directly at risk. They then continue as per usual. That does not, in terms of the directive, say that they have to self-isolate. They just have to be monitored, which means that they would be checked on a day-to-day basis to show if they then develop symptoms. If they develop symptoms, we go straight to scenario 2, which is employees that have symptoms. If that person has had a high-risk exposure, that would be where the person needs to go on what they refer to as special leave or self-isolation, quarantine for at least 7 days. And if the person wants to return back to work within 8 days to 14 days, they need to have a negative test that is presented to the employer. Or they have to then self-isolate for a period of no less than 7 days and up to 14 days. When it's 14 days, they can return back to work. If during that period they do not show symptoms, it is then assumed that they do not have COVID-19 and they can continue as usual. If they start to get symptoms of COVID-19 during their self-isolation, they jump up to level 2, which is where you have symptoms but not a positive test. If at any stage you have a test and you test positive, you go straight to scenario 1. And that's how the directives work effectively. But when it comes to all other illnesses, the normal sick leaves aspects apply. And that means the duty of the employees to inform the employers that they are unfit for work and will not be providing their services for that day, even though they're sitting at the same desk, maybe doing private things and not doing their work. Maternity and parental leave aspects, we all know, remain exactly the same, and family responsibility aspects also remain exactly the same. We need to understand that family responsibility was amended at the start of the year to remove when an employee's child is born, which now falls under maternity and parental leave, and family responsibility would then be as a result of a direct loss of a direct family member. So we are going to, and it's an unfortunate occurrence as a result of this pandemic, is that there is going to be loss of life. We know that there already has been. We see the cases that are happening. It might be for COVID-related matters, or it might just be for natural reasons or an accident or so forth. But the same processes apply when it comes to family responsibility leave, and employees would then have to provide proof that they are taking family responsibility leave that falls within the definition of what is seen as family responsibility leave, and proof would be in the form of a death certificate or any of the sort. So let's talk about timing. Now, it's quite an interesting scenario that despite the fact people are working from home and not having to travel into the office, that they can still be late for work. And that would be where there are still contractual obligations in place. All the contractual obligations of employees, which would be to adhere to working hours and adhere to meeting schedules and or appointments or anything that is set up for them, still remain in place. So despite that an employee is at home or is expected to be working from home, they can still be tardy. They can still have unauthorized absence in certain circumstances that the employer still has the ability to monitor. What we need to do in a working from home environment is monitor the reasonability of aspects, because I refer to it as the two blue ticks mentality. And that would be where, despite the fact that it might be way after hours, you send one of your staff members a text or an instruction, we now know that with WhatsApp, you can see whether they've read it or not. And I've had a couple of cases where employers get very unhappy with the fact that they have not received a response. They might even take it as being insolent or insubordinate in certain aspects, but it is way beyond their daily and weekly rest periods. So we need to understand that there is a common law duty to act in the best interest of the employer, but there's also contractual duties on the employer to adhere to when it comes to working hours and times, all within the realms of reasonability. So what I'm saying is that it can't be a common occurrence that every single night at 11 o'clock, we're expecting employees to get back to us. But if there's a very important body of work that needs to happen, an employer could do it, but it shouldn't become the new norm. That should not become part of the new norm. And one thing that's quite close to my heart, and what I was dealing with quite a bit coming out of the lockdown and going into the phased-in approach, was a lot of not doing anything about it because they were almost waiting for the employees to return to work. Now, we know that that's a scenario that's not going to happen very soon. So when it comes to managing performance, the processes still fall within the jurisdiction and the ambit of the employer. And employees now need to understand, and there needs to be a balance of what employees may see as micromanagement versus where an employer is saying that I can't have that hands-on approach that I would usually. I'm now going to have to check in with you. And we've seen that with platforms such as Microsoft 365 and Zoom and team aspects, where there is many new ways of being able to keep up to date with the workings of your staff and your employees. But the big thing that we need to understand is that employees are also dealing with a new reality. And with that new reality and the new change can sometimes create a bit of impact with regards to their way of doing things. But what we need to understand, and that's where's that first screen that I showed you guys, is that the reciprocal relationship remains in place. If you want to receive that remuneration that I am paying you, you then still have to provide me that same standard of work. If that standard of work, because where you would normally be, let's say, frequenting clients or frequenting the work place or meeting here or meeting there, is now impacted on the fact that we now, under the directive, are encouraged to work from home, that would be when the employer and the employee now need to go and arrange new relationships and a new reciprocal relationship. But if there is nothing that is changed in those two parties, that standard of work remains in place. So what do we need to look out for as employers when it comes to dealing with performance? And that is that, and I know we're calling it the new norm, I'm starting to call it the new excuse, because the moment an employee who was achieving the required standard, let's say not blowing the lights out, but was achieving the required standard, now under a work from home scenario is now not achieving that standard. The quick scenario is just to say, well, I'm not used to this COVID-19 relationship. I'm having to work from home and my chair is uncomfortable. We hear all the excuses. What we need to try and determine when it comes to the management of performance of our staff is it misconduct or is it actually their incapacity or their inability to meet the standard? A nice, easy example that I like to use, but it's something that we should try and work on in their mind, is understanding that poor work performance is the inability to meet a required standard versus misconduct where I am able to do the job, but I just failed to do it. I was negligent, for example. So negligence would be, there's a body of work that I normally do, I have done it in the past, and I failed to do it. Versus poor work performance where no matter how hard I try, or no matter what I'm doing to try and bake the cake, my cake is flopping. That would be how you would then gauge which process you want to follow, because we know that the misconduct route and the performance route are vastly different when it comes to the procedural fairness of dealing with such circumstances. But when it comes to dealing with performance improvement plans while an employee is on, let's say, working from home, the same aspects still come into play. There's nothing that prevents an employer from managing one's performance despite the fact that there's a temporary scenario of them working from home or even the new norm of permanently working from home. What we need to know is that if we've amended that standard of work that is expected, or if we have got a new arrangement, that we need to prove that the employee is aware of it. So the first thing that any employer that goes to a forum for let's say anybody that wants to go and prove that something has occurred, the first thing that they do at the CCMA or at the Labour Court is go improve the awareness of the standard, the validity of that standard, as well as the reasonability of that standard. So you can't, obviously, if there's a directive that says that employees have to go and see so many clients or prospects where they physically can't or they legally can't, we can't obviously go and hold them accountable for that because it won't be reasonable and won't be valid. That's where we need to consider the totality of circumstances. And what we're doing quite often now, when we're sitting in over 100 days of lockdown, is we're having a look at where we are sitting so far down the line. Have employees now started to adapt to the new scenarios? I had a scenario in a client where they had a sales team and an individual was not meeting sales targets. And they kept on saying that it was due to lockdown and was due to, despite the fact that they're an essential service, they were saying that their clients are affected. Yet they were the only person in that department. So you go and compare them to the other people in that department, and you can see that the excuse is unreasonable because why is everybody else able to do it but you aren't? But taking into account the totality of circumstances is something that we would then probably have to do and place a little bit more emphasis on, is having a look at the possible excuses. And if there are excuses, having a look at rational and reasonable reasons why those are not a valid excuse. Because in certain scenarios, they might be, but in certain scenarios, they might not be. We are also, there's no lawful impediment in terms of the Labour Relations Act that stops employers from managing and counseling formal performance management sessions via video conference. Everything remains the same. Nothing says that it takes away an employee's rights to a statement of case by doing it via video conferencing. We might need to then take into account a couple of logistical aspects of it, but when it comes to doing it via conferencing, everything remains in place. We might be having to look at a part of performance management processes, the reasonable times to improve. We might need to take into account considerations of trying to get used to the new norm and incorporate that in our performance management models, and also being a little bit more open-minded when it comes to alternatives. Now, if anybody's gone through a process where they've had to dismiss an employee as a result of poor performance or misconduct, would see that they are vastly different. Because misconduct would be you have broken the rule, you've breached our trust, we can't continue going in this manner. Where it comes to performance management, where they might have not been performing in a spell, they don't prescribe termination as being the next step automatically when it comes to the process. They always look at alternatives to dismissal. Is there a way that we can adapt the role to accommodate that incapacity of not meeting that standard? So what I'm saying is that under the new circumstances where a person is not able to meet all of the obligations of their responsibilities, can we take those away, but then adjust the remuneration proportionally based on that standard of work required versus the remuneration? Is there demotion that can happen? Is there any other amendment to terms and conditions that can be as an alternative to dismissal? Versus misconduct, where you've proven that you can't keep to the rules and the regulations of the company, and therefore the next step would be termination. So let's talk about when it comes to misconduct. New normal or new excuse. Now, when it comes to disciplinary codes and procedures, I know I usually use the Hollard one as a go-to. And the reason why I'm using it in this session as well is I know that you guys sit almost in the same offices with them and you're quite closely affiliated with them. And what happens in disciplinary codes, and almost every single disciplinary code that I've seen, is that we want employees to adhere to their rules and procedures and observe the laws of the country. Those are in there. So where employees say that we now need to go and amend our terms and conditions and our rules and regulations as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, that's already covered by, first of all, most disciplinary codes and also COVID-19 regulations and directives. So an employee that breaks the rules and regulations of the country gives the employer a jurisdiction to then take disciplinary action. What do I mean by that? We actually had a scenario in the hard lockdown. Now, if you remember the hard lockdown, everybody was sitting at home except for essential services providers. Now, one of our essential service providers was a manufacturer of food. They found through social media one of their employees crossing provincial borders to go home. and then come back after a weekend where they had a 3-day off scenario. They saw this on their person's social media, and we actually successfully terminated that employee as a result of the risk that they were creating. Because you guys would remember that where there was the hard directive, it was an offense to commit, it was an offense to contravene the Disaster Management Act. Now, not only did they breach the Disaster Management Act, but there were scenarios where employees that became infected that would then return to, let's say, a factory manufacturing food could have the potential of closing down that entire factory. So an employee that is breaching the rules and regulations of the company that have been prescribed by the government gives them jurisdiction to take disciplinary action, and the courts agreed with us. There was an urgent interdict on that due to the challenge on the reasonability of it, and we successfully terminated that employee for not only breaching the rules that were temporary of that employer, but the rules of the country going forward. Now, what I want to talk about as well when it comes to virtual disciplinary hearings and virtual processes is that there is no, and I said it again when it was poor work performance, there is no impediment in the Labour Relations Act that says that for an employer to successfully have a hearing and provide an employee with the opportunity to state their case, that it has to be done while sitting in the same room. The Labour Relations Act doesn't say that. Why I'm saying this is because the biggest challenge that I've been getting from a lot of unions and employees who find themselves in hot water is that they are saying that their rights are being infringed as a result of it happening via Zoom, it happening via Teams meetings, Skype, whatever your choice would be. And I need to put that aside because there is no lawful impediment. In fact, even the CCMA itself, when we were in hard lockdown, had entered into rules that were allowing us to have arbitrations via video conferencing. And the arbitration is effectively the same as a quasi-court case, a hearing in Dover that would happen where there is severe consequences on both sides. So if the CCMA was able to adhere to the Labour Relations Act by doing so, employees do not have to be in the presence. But we need to understand that if there is a logistical issue that is preventing an employee from being able to state their case, that is something that we need to take into account, because the main principle of progressive discipline when it comes to issuing employees with progressive discipline to try and correct their behavior is ensuring that they are given the opportunity to state their case. They call it the ad iterum partem rule, which is basically to listen to the other side or let the other side be heard as well. So what this means is that any sanction short of dismissal, such as a warning or a final written warning, cannot just be emailed unilaterally or left in a pigeonhole or any of those sorts. There are notices, so the employee just has to acknowledge receipt thereof. But in order for it to be issued fairly, employers need to, first of all, give them an opportunity to state their case. Now that gets misconstrued of it must be a hearing. That is not the case. A disciplinary hearing is only for where there is a scenario of a termination of employment. But when it comes to issuing of progressive discipline sanction short of dismissal, giving them an opportunity to state why they shouldn't receive it. Effectively, why were you late for work? Or why did this happen? And the person gives their response, even if it is verbally, is more than enough to satisfy the ad iterum partem rule. But when it comes to dismissal law, we know that we have to have a disciplinary hearing. It has to be done procedurally and substantively fairly. So the kickback that we get in, and I was talking about it earlier, was where employees are saying that it's an infringement on their rights. It is not. But what we need to know as employers is that we have to have added consideration. Where under normal circumstances and where we're sitting across from each other in an office, it's a lot easier to issue notices and to prove that things occurred. When it comes to correspondence or video conferencing, then things are getting issued, we need to take cognizance of it. So where notice would be issued to an employee in writing and they would sign having received that notice, we need to understand that it's not that they are signing acceptance of it, they are signing receipt of it. We need to prove that that employee received it and that they are aware of their rights. So in any notice to attend, it usually has the rights when it comes to their witnesses that they can bring, their representation, all those types of things. The best thing to do now is to simply ask the employee to send a return email or WhatsApp or whatever you do, whatever platform you use, just acknowledging that they have received it and they understand their rights as per that notice. That's the best thing, and that will satisfy the needs of a notice being sufficiently issued. Despite the fact that it's happening via teleconferencing or video conferencing, it still has to be done with a minimum of 48 hours notice given to those employees. Again, when it comes to finding whether somebody has actually misconducted themselves or not, what we're looking at is taking into account the totality of circumstances, as well as when we're looking at actually fulfilling what we need to from a procedure and substantive point of view, looking at the logistical considerations. So if the employee is in a scenario where their network is not working correctly, that they can't hear the chairperson, they can't hear that, we need to be considerate of the fact of maybe them reconvening or having or reconvening at a later date or having a postponement, where under normal circumstances we wouldn't postpone just on face value like that. Under the new circumstances, we need to make sure that we have ensured that they can hear everything that we're saying. And I know when I chair hearings through video conference, I add extra emphasis on letting that person mouth to me that they understood everything that I've said. Because when it comes to the presentation of evidence, there might be logistical issues, and we need to be patient when it comes to those aspects, as well as letting witnesses dial in and giving them an opportunity to state their case on behalf of whoever they're representing and being cross-questioned. And now, when it comes to representation, we know that almost all employers don't allow outside representation when it comes to internal matters. But you guys don't know who's sitting next to me right now. And the same thing would happen where you've got an accused party that's sitting on the other side of a video conferencing screen. You don't know who's coaching them. You don't know who's doing this. So if you pick up that an employee is being coached or that there's an imbalance of the rights as you as a complainant, you can raise that to the chairperson, and the chairperson will then assist. Notices and outcomes still need to be issued to employees, and they need to be issued through whatever communication or video conferencing process was done in the first place to have the hearing for them. So if it is a dismissal, it would be done via video conferencing or through a notice, and the employer needs to prove that that person was that and issued that notice in terms of it. So let's have a look at new forms of misconduct that we find in. So we have been seeing a lot of scenarios where employees are refusing to attend to work commitments because they fear for their safety, be it coming into the office, or be it going to a client, or be it going to a organization or anything that is required of them. We need to, as employers, assess the reasonability of the refusal. You can't unreasonably refuse. And for example, if I refuse to go to the CCMA, I would need to provide valid proof as to why I'm refusing. And saying that I don't feel that they adhere to standards would be very difficult for me to prove, because it's a government law. So unless I can actually go and show a transgression of the government directive, my refusal to go and attend that premises would be untoward. But if I find myself on the premises and I see that they are not maintaining social distancing or they're not adhering to the directives, and I remove myself as an employee from that scenario and I provide proof of what was happening, then I would be able to go and show my employer, listen, this is what was happening and this is why I then refused to do that. But when it comes to the refusal to attend work commitments, we need to look at the reasonability of the refusal, the reasonable person test. I spoke already about absence and timekeeping, which have new meanings, and we can still call somebody being absent from work despite the fact that they can prove that they were at home at the time and they're working from home. It doesn't mean that they were actually providing with actual work. We've seen a lot of employers that have systems that employees need to log on to, and they are logging on to long after when they were supposed to be working. And we know that there's obviously a balance in some circumstances where some employees work late into the night and not in the morning, but we need to make sure that the employer is aware of, let's say, that the fact that they're not going to be reachable in the morning, or whatever the case may be. If there's a change to terms and conditions, it can't be unilateral, it has to be from both sides. I already spoke about the breach of government regulations during work or in private. If that has an impact, a direct impact on the employer has jurisdiction. So the employer would go and show how it would impact on them, be it the impact of their safety and security, be it a breach of their rules and regulations. All those types of aspects can be taken into account. And that leads me on to the next thing that's happening. A lot of people are sitting in their home offices, or even if they're still, and we've got a lot of people that are still in lockdown that are saying and doing stupid things on social media. I think that misconduct through social media, and I've got a whole nother session on social media, it takes me 2 hours to do that session. People are doing things wrong. And if it impacts, so put it this way, the summary of social media misconduct for employers would be that if it has the ability to impact on the employer's good name, or actually has the potential or actually impacts on the employer's good name, or has the potential or actually impacts on the working environment, despite the fact it was done at home, in private, after hours, an employer would have jurisdiction to take disciplinary action. That includes the scenario of if you bite the hand that feeds you, if you say something bad about your employer, they can then take disciplinary action. Now, and I spoke when we were still in the green room and everybody was coming on. I think it was Paul that was talking about why aren't you having a drink already by the time by the time we're sitting at what now, nearly 11 o'clock. And obviously that was a joke, but basically when it comes to fitness for work, we don't know what employees are doing during lunchtime. We don't really care what they're doing during lunchtime. We also know that when it comes to something that occurred in 2018, it was in September, they refer to it as the Prince Judgment. For those that aren't aware of it, that was when they allowed or they legalized the private use of cannabis in your private residence. Now, if your private residence just happens to be your home, and we know that a lot of employees by now might be running out of tobacco unless they purchasing the tobacco through illicit markets. Maybe they were also doing a bit of gardening and growing for their own personal use. We don't really care, but what we do care is that you are fit for work. So what you do in your lunch hour, if it impacts on your working abilities or your ability to adhere to your working standard, that's where the employer can then take disciplinary action. And that is another segue that goes into dress codes. Now, we've seen a lot of employees that end up in situations where they don't want to put on their cameras for their clients because they've just gotten out of bed. And employers, where it does have an impact on their working abilities or on the working relationship, can take disciplinary action because the employees technically, during working hours, still have to adhere to the dress codes. Now, I know that it's not practical and a lot of employers have really been quite relaxed when it comes to dress codes, but we know that there's always those few that might take it to the next level. And employers still have the ability to take action against those that are not fit for work, are in an unfit state to work, or that aren't adhering to the dress code, which then makes them breach or might the company in bad name. Now that you are not logged into your office's Wi-Fi or using the office's local area network, it doesn't mean that the employer doesn't have the ability to monitor communications. In terms of the RECA Act, the employer has what they refer to as the business exception rule. That means that even though they might not have your permission, they still, in terms of the business exceptions rule, can monitor communications that are used through a facility that is afforded by them. So if it's not the Wi-Fi, it might be the domain, the @itu.co.za. It might be a facility in the form of the actual notebook that is issued to the employee. It might be in terms of the data or the 3D connection, 3G connection or 5G connection nowadays that was issued to the employee. And what we're finding, and I'll put it in as last, is that there are a lot of people that are referring to tech issues as being the reason for them not being able to adhere to their contractual obligations. When it comes to tech issues, just like your obligation to get to work, and I can refer to a vehicle that has a breakdown as being a tech issue, but the same scenario would happen. If you're wanting to go to work and you know that your car is not working, you would need to go and do something about it. You cannot go and rely on the fact that now when people are expecting you to then say, oh, well, my internet's down. And in a lot of scenarios where there are repeat offenders of tech issues, we then we have the responsibility, or if it's really impacting on the employer's ability to adhere to the contractual, or the employee's ability to adhere to their contractual obligations, ask for sufficient proof. Now, we know that we're living in a world where there is scheduled outages and actual outages of power and things like that. We know those circumstances, but the reasonable person test is what the employer would then be able to apply. So, who is responsible for what? Your coal face is your line managers, supervisors, team leaders, managers, and the like. They are the ones on the coal face, and they are the ones that have to ensure that they maintain and institute discipline. Because we are now sitting in a decentralized working environment, out of sight, out of mind, it might bring the ability to adhere to working conditions out of the hands of the manager, and the manager might be seen as being in breach of the company's disciplinary code by not being the custodian and not enforcing the rules as they should be doing so. The Human Resources Department is that backup that plays an advisory and enabling role to it, and then you can call the Employee Relations Department, which would be like myself, or at I2 if you have your own department, the one that is then supporting the HR department in doing so. I know as LabourNet, that's what we do. That's what we're going to be doing for I2 going forward. But as I said, and just mentioning it, the failure by managers to maintain and institute discipline, as well as employees and co-workers who omit information regarding misconduct or inappropriate behavior from their side, might be seen as breach. Because in a COVID-19 environment, the consequences on the company are far-reaching, where there are possible breaches of safety and security and possible breaches of what is expected of people from a working relationship. I'm moving a bit faster because I'm not running out of time, but my last slide is basically, I think, when we saw the advent of smartphones, it blurred the lines between our work lives and our personal lives. But I think now, where we are sitting in a scenario of what we're referring to as the new norm, and employers now having staff working from home, I don't think that there's ever been a time where our work life and our private life and the line between the two has been more blurred. And that's something that we need to really take cognizance of, and how we're going to adapt that to our businesses going forward. So that being said, I have been sharing my screen, so I haven't been able to see if there's been any interaction or if any comments or anything. I don't know if we have time to do that. Tove, would you be able to assist me if there's been any questions or anything that you want to confirm with myself? Or has there been any questions or anything?
Thank you very much, Barry. We've got a few questions. I know we're out of time, so if anybody wants to leave, please feel free to leave. I'm going to read the questions up.
So if anybody does leave, I won't feel offended. I know that I've pushed the limits when it comes to the hour that I had. I'm very, very sorry about that. But yes, it's been great, and I hope to meet you all in person one day. But yeah, thank you very much. But if anybody has any questions, I also have an appointment that I actually got to go to physically later. So I will stay around for a minute or so. But yes, Tove, I haven't got it in front of me.
Here's a question for you, Barry. Are employers responsible for providing a proper chair or desk if staff can't afford a decent chair and end up with back problems?
Yeah, so that's quite an interesting scenario. And I mean, does that also mean that we also need subsidized meals, and we also need all those benefits that we're getting from the office? Do we need a motherland coffee to be delivered to everybody's office? All those types of questions. And the answer, again, is it should be on a case-by-case scenario. Not everybody is as fortunate enough to go and have a nice big comfy chair sitting at home in their home office that they would when it comes to what they would have had at the office. So it all comes down to the reasonability of the request and what is required. So the best scenario when it comes to a temporary arrangement as such versus a permanent arrangement as such would be up to the employer and the employee to then sit and discuss these needs themselves and between the two. Because it might create a nightmare to have to then create an asset registry for all the staff that are then going to then take company property, not to mention, and you guys would probably be the first to tell me about this, not to mention the potential insurance aspects of, let's say, having printers and chairs and desks and stuff removed from the office where they're insured to a private residence where they might not be insured. So that all needs to get done on a case-by-case basis. But, you know, we need to have a look at the balance, and everything happens in a balance. So if the employee is saying it's my employer's responsibility to provide me with a chair, and the employer can't reasonably do so, does that mean that the employee is then going to now start reporting for work? So that's the balance that needs to then happen.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
so in closing, I think it needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. I don't think that it would be practical for everybody to come and take their favorite piece of furniture.
Yeah. Okay. And then we have another question from Dave Hopcroft. He says, can employees whose primary function complements the work from home practice be forced by employers to return to the office full time, particularly while government is still encouraging the work from home policy?
So it all comes to the contractual obligations. So I think the simple answer to that question would be that we cannot unilaterally change terms and conditions unless there is a lawful impediment allowing us to do so. So like what I was saying, where it was a scenario of a work from home scenario that is being implemented because government is saying that people should work from home unless they can't work from home. So I think that what we need to balance is, are we changing terms and conditions, which can't be done unilaterally, or are we acting within the confines of those terms and conditions, which would be same and similar, or within the nature of the employment? Does that answer the question?
Dave, if you're still online, does that answer your question? Okay, I'm not sure if Dave is still on, Barry. Just one last question, because I know you need to dash. Does the employer need to provide web connection, so connectivity for the employees while working from home?
So again, if I'm expecting you to do work with an online connection that I would have provided you under your contractual obligations while you were working at the office, if I expect you to do that from home because I can't host you at the office, then I would be required to provide you with an internet connection. So if there's an expectation for employees to be online, and it was something that would have been provided under their normal contractual obligations at the office, bar for them saying, okay, and that's where that balance comes in. Okay, if I can't reasonably, or if your area that you're living doesn't have internet connectivity, then you must come to the office. If it's not, if you can't come to the office for, let's say, having a comorbidity or being over the age of 60, that then creates, again, a lawful impediment. And then we have to sit and renegotiate the terms and conditions.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. That's very clear, Barry. Last question, I promise. If you're a high risk exposure and you're required to take the 7 days quarantine, but you show no symptoms and you can still work from home, should those 7 days be treated as sick leave or annual leave if you're still able to work?
Yes. So this is where it becomes very interesting. So just to confirm, it's that a person that has got a confirmed high risk exposure, which means that it's been confirmed that you've been exposed to somebody with COVID-19 for a period of time exceeding 15 minutes, and you've been notified by whichever company or department that says you have been exposed. Mm-hmm. You have to, by law, self-isolate for minimum 7 days. And you're only allowed to return to work on day 8 with a negative test result. Mm-hmm. If you want to return to work, it has to be after 14 days. But now, what does that 14 days sit as? That's the question. That's the burning question. And remember, these are government directives that says you can't return to work. So just like when there was lockdown and the access to the tours, where they say you can't go to work, they can't expect the employer to pay. Therefore, government pays. So under these scenarios where they say you can't come back to work for 14 days, we can't expect the employer to pay, which means that it would be what they refer to as special leave. Special leave is where they would have access to UIF benefits for a period of 14 days without a sick note, just because they've got a proven high exposure. That is the minimum. That is the minimum. But what we've seen in practice is a lot of employers have got leave policies that are allowing for special leave to be paid by the employer. But then they're requiring that test on day 8 rather than sitting at home for 14 days. But remember, that would be where an employee is unable to work from home. That you need to put in a form of leave. If the employee can continue working, and instead of working from the office, they're just going to work from home, then the 7 days or 14 days is immaterial. They're going to get paid for it anyway. But where they are unable to adhere to their contractual obligations, that would be then seen as special leave. And what the employee wants to do is they want to go and get a test as soon as possible, because rather than waiting for the symptoms, rather get the test. If the test is positive, you click up into scenario 2, and then you will have access to the relief benefits directly with that positive test. And if you've got a positive test, you would then have access to sick leave, because it's proven that you're sick. Remember, when you self-isolate or whether you've just been exposed, high or low, there's no proof that you're sick. You're asymptomatic. But even if you are asymptomatic, and you then have a proven test result that says that you contracted COVID-19, you are then, in terms of medical rules, unfit for work, and you would then be able to claim sick leave.
Wow, thank you very much, Barry. Thank you for taking your time and for joining us. This was indeed a very informative session, and I suspect we'll request you to come back and unpack some of the subjects that we touched on today. So thank you very much.
Tove, you've gone into slow-mo. You went into alien mode.
Tove, you're glitching.
Am I glitching? Okay, Tammy, you can talk.
It must be because you're speaking to us live from the top of Table Mountain. If you came down to Table Mountain, you might be okay.
That's true.
Thanks, Barry. That was great, and I think informative, and for us all to think about to make sure that we are adhering to what we need to be. But yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch with Barry or want some more information, please do shout. Give us a shout. We'll put you in touch, and I'm sure Barry will be happy to answer any other questions that you have. Otherwise, if you want to unmute yourself and say bye, or you have a quick last question, because I know Barry has to run, so don't want to put you under too much pressure.
I don't think I'm going to have time for a last question.
Okay,
I have to run.
cool.
I'm sorry for being rude.
That's fine, no worries.
I'll extend that invite. Anybody that wants to get in touch with me or has any burning questions, I've got a relationship with I2 going forward. Please get in touch with any of the managers. They'll get in touch with me, and we can then chat about it. But thank you so much, Tammy, and thank you, Tove, for hosting me. And I look forward to working with you guys.
Great. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you. Thank
Have
you,
a good
Barry.
day. Good luck with your meeting.
Awesome. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks, Barry.
Bye, Chris. Thank you. Bye, guys. And as tradition, feel free to put on your mic, put on your videos, and say goodbye.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye, Paul.
Bye.
Have a nice day.
Bye, Vaughn. Nice seeing you.
Tammy, I'm going to put my camera on.
Hey,
Can you
Paul.
see?
You're trying to
see
get me fired.
something?
Oh my gosh.
So it doesn't help that I've got all our wine stacked here behind me either.
All right, cheers. Thanks a lot,
Thanks for
guys.
joining.
We'll chat soon.
Cool. Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Cool, guys. Thanks. And if you check our social media, we had a cool book club session on Friday, which we discussed some cool and interesting books. So if you're interested, you can check. We had a social media post of the list. So feel free to check it out if you need something cool to read. And then, yeah, if you need a recording of this session, please shout and let us know we did record it, and we can send it on to you. If you want to share with some of your team members or anyone else, we're happy to share it with you. So just give us a shout, and the same with most of our other sessions. So please just give us a shout on that. Cool, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck with the